In today's video, I'll be giving you guys 3 reasons why the Atlanta Falcons will make the playoffs in 2025. Subscribe and like the video if you do go on to enjoy. Let's hop into it. And we are going to begin with my first reason why the Atlanta Falcons will make the playoffs in 2025, and that is Michael Penix showed glimpses of great play in 2024. Now, in this little area, I want to focus specifically on Michael Penix Jr. I also kind of want to talk about the Kirk Cousins situations too, so I'll kind of toss that in towards the back end of this one before we get to our second reason. But yeah, I thought Penix looked pretty darn good in his rookie year. Now, granted, he only played, I think, in like 3 games, so very limited sample size to work with here. However, I think that what we saw in those games was actually fairly impressive. So as you can see, he did play in 5 games, but he only started in 3 of the games, and for the most part, his stats really aren't that bad. 775 yards, 3 touchdowns, 3 picks. It's important to mention that some of those interceptions really weren't his fault. I think one of those specifically was off the hands of Kyle Pitts. Don't quote me on that, but I believe that's the case. Pretty decent stats for the most part. Not, overwhelmingly good or anything like that. They also had a loss to Carolina, which you don't want. They also had a loss to Washington. But when you look at the games in which Penix played, they scored 34 against the Giants. They scored 24 against Washington, and they scored 38 versus Carolina. Those are some very respectable numbers that highlight the efficiency in which the offense was playing with. The nice thing about this team is it's a pretty solid offense when you actually kind of like look at who is around Michael Penix. You have 2 very good running backs, one of which is probably a top 5 running back in Bijan Robinson. Shout out Texas, by the way. Tyler Allgeier's very freaking good. Drake London is really becoming that true alpha #1 receiver that he was drafted to be. Had one of his best years last year. You pair him up with Darnell Mooney, who looked really good last year too. Ray McLeod. You had a DJ Chark. You have a Kadero Hodge. It's a pretty solid receiving core. I'm not necessarily in love with the depth there, and I think ideally I'd like to find another big body receiver that can actually win downfield, but I like this receiving core quite a bit. Pair that up with a Kyle Pitts, who is kind of in for a make or break year. I mean, listen, if you're Kyle Pitts, you don't really have any excuses. You have Michael Penix at quarterback, who's a passing first, guy. He's not going to be a dump off merchant like a Kirk Cousins or any of the other quarterbacks they've had for the past couple years. Penix will make high level throws. All that said, you have a great set of supporting cast surrounding him. Pair that up with a pretty solid offensive line. Yes, you lose your starting center, but I don't think it's that big of a deal. You should be fine there. And I think for Penix, you have everything you really need to succeed. There's continuity in the coaching staff. There's continuity on this offense. You now get a full off season to be the guy in Atlanta. And I think this could really be a big step forward in the development of Michael Penix's career. Now, in terms of what I'm expecting from Penix, I don't really know. Does he have to play at a Pro Bowl level? Not necessarily. I think if this Falcons team wants to be considered like a contender or, a playoff threat, I think they need Penix to play at a respectable level, like a top 15 quarterback level, because if he can hit those numbers and get to that spot, then that would tell you a lot about this Falcons offense. But again, I don't really think that this offense needs to have Penix go out there and, throw for 5,000 passing yards, 40 touchdowns, and less than 10 picks. Like, he doesn't have to do that. Obviously, if he does that, then sweet, we have a future, Pro Bowl, all-pro quarterback. But I think for Penix, just get over 3,000 yards, get over 20 touchdowns, keep the interceptions to a minimum. And I think that's a pretty successful first, honestly, kind of rookie year for him. The nice thing too about this is you have a backup quarterback in Kirk Cousins who, was a starting quarterback last year and has been a starting quarterback his whole career. This is really his first time being the full-time backup. And assuming he does not get traded anytime soon, which I don't think he will, then he could serve as a really good mentor and somebody to keep Penix composed in tough games or tough situations. Not that Penix seems to be somebody that's like on a roller coaster, but, he's a rookie. Basically a rookie quarterback heading into his first year starting. There's going to be ups and downs. And when you have a guy like Kirk Cousins who is experienced, it could actually do a lot for a guy like Michael Penix. So I'm expecting Michael to take a big step forward next year. I'm not necessarily saying that he's going to be a Pro Bowl or all-pro quarterback. I don't think the Atlanta Falcons need him to get there, but if they can get him to play at like a top 16, 17 quarterback level, pair that up with a big year from Bijan, a big year from London, Pitts, this offensive line, and the defense, which we'll talk about here in just a moment, then I think this Falcons team could really take a step forward. Now, briefly, let's talk about the Kirk Cousins situation. I do think at some point there is the possibility that there will be some trade conversations surrounding Kirk Cousins, probably to a team that may end up with an injured quarterback. I could see a situation situation where a team that wants to make the playoffs, that wants to go all in, has their starting quarterback get injured and might be looking for, the guy to keep them afloat. The tough thing with the conversation there is the contract situation, because let's just throw an example out here. Let's say the Bengals, Joe Burrow misses time, right? And you want to find a guy that can keep you afloat. Trading for Kirk Cousins and that contract just wouldn't make any sense. So I would assume that whatever team could get into the Kirk Cousins sweepstakes in terms of a trade would want Atlanta to probably eat up that salary, and you might see sort of a buyout situation. I kind of do think Atlanta's kind of forced to keep him on the roster. Like, if you cut him, you have so much dead money. You have the cap space available because you have this rookie quarterback. I still thought at the time it was a little silly to draft Penix round 1 and then sign Kirk Cousins to this massive deal. It hasn't really worked out for the Atlanta Falcons, and I think if they were smart, they would have looked to try to get off this Kirk Cousins deal as soon as possible so that they can build fully around Michael Penix. But at the same time, if Penix were to miss a game here or there, he does have a bit of an injury history in college, then having a backup like Kirk Cousins could actually prove to be a little bit worthwhile. So just kind of keep an eye on that. All in all, I think Penix is in for a big year, and we'll see what happens with Kirk Cousins. Let's now talk about my second reason why the Atlanta Falcons can make the playoffs in 2024, and that is I think they improved their biggest defensive flaw. So last year, this defense was really not particularly great, but their biggest weakness was just their pass rush. They had some decent members in the secondary. A.J. Terrell, Jesse Bates. They also had Justin Simmons last year too. So there was actually a decent little secondary here. The problem is they really struggled to get after the quarterback. They were relying so heavily on second, third, fourth round picks and guys like Rook Orororo. I'm sorry if I mispronounced that name. I'd never know how to say his name. They were also relying quite heavily on guys like Braylon Trice, and he just wasn't ready for the offering at that point. And they just didn't have guys really that could consistently get after the quarterback. They were relying on older or unproven guys, and that defensive line just really didn't have it. Now, towards the back end, they did figure out some ways to start getting after the quarterback. So it was improved in the back end of the year, but it was really a tough issue that really handicapped that defense for a large part of the season, which was a shame because the linebacker play was actually pretty good. And you paired that up with the secondary play that, on paper had some really talented pieces. They just didn't have the dogs up front to really get after the quarterback. And for defenses, you have to have every single unit be in sync. And frankly, a good pass rush is honestly like one of the most important units in your entire defense, if not the most important units. So what did this Falcons do? Well, with their limited assets, and I say limited, they did not have a ton of money and draft capital. They only had a couple picks here and there, but I think they did a pretty nice job. Now, I do want to say that I do think the trade in the first round of the draft was a little crazy. Talk about that in here in just a moment. But in terms of who they brought in, you bring in Leonard Floyd, who can get after the quarterback. You drafted James Pierce Jr., who probably come off the edge and be a pass rusher for you. You also drafted James Pierce Jr., and to me, that is where I have a bit of an issue. Now, in case you forgot, the Falcons did trade into the first round. They had their own first round pick. They started off with Jalen Walker, which I loved that pick for Atlanta. I think it's the perfect fit. We'll talk about him just in a moment. But then they also doubled down in the back end of round 1 by trading back into round 1 and drafting James Pierce Jr. They gave up a 2026 first round pick and a little bit more. Now look, I think Pierce has a pretty high ceiling to be a really good pass rusher in the NFL, but I also think his floor is quite low. Like, I think there's a chance that James becomes a superstar in this league, but I also think there's a chance that he's not very good in the NFL. And my worry and issue is you traded a first round pick in 2026 in a draft that is probably going to be pretty darn good. And yes, Atlanta is not going to have a top 10 pick. If anything, they're hoping to have it be a pick within the 20s, and of course, hopefully the 30s. They're hoping to make the playoffs and not have great draft capital. So, why not trade it away to go ahead and just double down an edge rusher? I kind of understand the logic, but at the same time, I could see this backfiring really easily. And even if it was a, let's just say 19th or 20th overall pick, I still think that having a first round pick is just so valuable, especially when you are a younger team that wants to accumulate more assets. This is not a Falcons team that has a ton of money to work with. This is a really expensive roster that they don't really have the flexibility to go out there and be super aggressive in free agency. Now, if you get off the Kirk deal, then it gets a little bit easier, but they still don't have a ton of money to work with. And so when you are a team that is tight on cash, the draft becomes a way for you to seriously improve your roster. And if this team is tight on cash next year, they're not going to have that first round pick to really improve the team for next year. Now, again, this could end up working out if James Pierce Jr. turns into a superstar. If Pierce becomes the guy, then there's no conversation here. It was a worthy trade, but it's a very risky bet that they have to make work. Now, let's actually talk about Walker and Pierce, because those are really the two guys that the Falcons are going to be banking on becoming successful pass rushers in the NFL. And I'll say this regarding both these guys: these are two athletic mother effers. These are just two dudes that are freak athletes in a lot of different ways. So for Walker, he played inside linebacker for Georgia in a lot of different snaps, but there was also times where he did come off the edge, and during those snaps he actually looked pretty darn good. There's a couple of plays against my Texas Longhorns where he got at Quinn Ewers and made his life a little miserable. The Falcons, if they were smart here, would not exclusively use him as an edge rusher. Maybe you develop him to become a full-time edge, but I think for year one you need to kind of move him around to allow him to get after the quarterback in multiple ways. I want to see him lined up all across the defensive line, even sometimes as an inside linebacker. I think there's so many ways you can use Jalen Walker, and with his flexibility and his versatility, it really will give this Falcons team something they just did really not have last year. He's an excellent athlete. He's got really good twitch, really good bend. He's a physical guy too. He's got the size, the tools. He's a little bit raw. He needs to kind of understand more pass rush technique, some nuance. Needs to know how to use some of that athleticism to his advantage, because right now he's really just a guy that can go on a wide nine and full on sprint up the quarterback and beat a tackle too, and that's kind of what he does right now. But eventually you want to see him become a bit more of a technician, which is how you elevate your game to getting to that next level. But if you can do so, then I think he's an awesome fit within this defense. And then there's James Pierce Jr., who, kind of similar to Jalen Walker, insane athlete, has good size, has good measurables, maybe a little bit lighter than what you would want. I don't really think either one of these guys will ever be dominant edge run defenders. Like, I think they could probably get a little bit bullied because of their size and them not being, traditional edge rushers. They're not like a DeMarcus Lawrence, who is jacked as hell, big as hell, but also can get after the quarterback. Those two guys are a little bit smaller. So I think in an ideal world, if it's like first or second down, they're probably not going to be on the field, but like a third down package where you're trying to get after the quarterback, these guys will be out there. Pierce has like some bend issues that I worry about a little bit, but he has a little bit more technique and athleticism to him, and he's just a bit more comfortable in that edge rushing spot, more so than Jalen Walker. Both guys are freak athletes. Both guys can get after the quarterback. It's going to be really tough for opposing offenses if Pierce and Walker can develop some pass rush nuance to cover both these guys, because these are just two freakishly athletic dudes. And if the defensive coordinator just lets these guys go, it could be really, really interesting. You pair that up with some development from some of those guys you took last year, like a Rook. We'll see what Braylon Trice can do, and so on and so forth. I'm actually a pretty big fan of what they did here. Again, I don't love the first round pick, but if it works out, then it could be really fun. So we'll keep an eye on that. Outside of the pass rush, though, this defense is really, really talented. AJ Terrell, Jesse Bates, those guys are manning your secondary. Mike Hughes had a nice year last year. D. Alfred's there as well. Caden Ellis is a really good player. Divine Diablo is also solid as hell too. So I'm a big fan of what this defense could look like in 2025. I think if this team wants to make the playoffs, the pass rush has to be there, and everything else needs to really mesh well together. And maybe this defense could become like a top 15, top 12 unit. But let us now head into my third reason why the Atlanta Falcons can make the playoffs in 2025, and that is the NFC South is pretty open. Now, there's one team that stands in the way, that being the Buccaneers, that I think is the biggest competition for the Atlanta Falcons. Because right now, when you look at the Panthers, I don't think they're quite yet there. I think they're a good team, but I don't think they're quite yet ready to take that big jump forward to becoming a contender for the playoffs. I think right now, they're like a 7 to 9 win team that's going to miss the playoffs, but will be a competitive unit. So then again, that leaves a bit of a space here for Atlanta to be that second team. New Orleans just got a new quarterback, new coach. They're retooling and rebuilding in some ways, so they're not probably going to be there either. When it comes to Tampa Bay, it's a really close battle between who has the better roster. When it comes to Tampa Bay, when it comes to Atlanta, there's pros and cons with both teams. Atlanta, rookie quarterback, well, not rookie, but young quarterback, very unknown there. when you look at Baker Mayfield in Tampa Bay, proven quarterback who has been incredible the past few years. There are certain issues on both sides defensively, like Buccaneers. They don't really have a go-to pass rusher right now. They're hoping that Hassan Reddick can become that. They have some newfound flexibility in the secondary with Benjamin Morrison and some other pieces. Whereas for Atlanta, they also have a bit of an unknown in terms of pass rushers, but they have some juice there that they feel pretty good about. And in the secondary, they feel pretty good. They have the pieces to get the job done. I didn't mention Xavier Watts either. He's a pretty good player too. So it's really close when you're comparing these two rosters. I think the one thing that makes me think Tampa Bay is still the favorite to win the division is just that I know what I'm getting from Baker Mayfield. Whereas with Penix, I don't quite yet know. I think I know. I think he's going to be good, but I don't know that. So if you were to ask me today who's going to win this division, I would probably say the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, and then I would say that Atlanta is probably that second team that could get really close to making the playoffs or potentially dethroning a team like Tampa Bay. Of course, I'm not going to predict that right now. I think it's very tight. It's very close. I would lean Tampa Bay, but I do think if Penix takes that big step forward, there is a chance that a team like the Atlanta Falcons could take a big enough step forward to overcome a team like Tampa Bay. This is not a situation where it's like you have a Philadelphia in your division or a Buffalo or a Baltimore or, a Kansas City or one of those teams. Tampa Bay is a good team, but they're not on that level yet. So because of that, there's always a chance that a team like Atlanta can string together a couple wins late in the season to get to 10 or 11 wins and end up winning the division. So I think a Atlanta Falcons divisional title is totally on the table. And if that's the case, congrats, you made the playoffs. But even if you don't win the division, I do think a 7th seed is very possible because when I look at the landscape of the NFC, yes, there's talent, but I think Atlanta's right there with them because, of course, you have your Philadelphias who are probably going to make it. The whole entire NFC North is competitive. I'm sure at least two of those teams make the playoffs. You look at NFC West, I like the Rams a lot. I think Seattle will be competitive. San Francisco can return to form. Arizona's competitive too. But there's a lot of question marks with a lot of these teams. And if you are Atlanta, again, you string together a couple wins late in the season, you might find yourself in a wild card spot. So it's all very intriguing about the Atlanta Falcons. Again, my reasons as to why the Falcons can make the playoffs in 2025. Michael Penix Jr. showed flashes of brilliance in his rookie year. They have an improved pass rush. And the NFC South is very open. You let me know in the comment section below how many games will the Atlanta Falcons win in 2025. And if you enjoyed, hit the like and subscribe button. Love you guys. Peace.